It's probably not an auspicious sign that I was bleeding heavily all morning from a self-inflicted cut to my cheek. And I had visions of actually mesmerizing you by these screens, which makes my cheek look about as big as my whole body here, as I ooze blood. But from what I'm going to say, it might not have been a bad idea, because it might have diverted you from what I'm going to talk about. My talk will be different from others at this conference. I was always an outlier when I taught at Utah in the 1980s, and I guess years later it's still just too comfortable a position for me not to slip back into it. And I think the best title, and give an indication of where this comes from, I think the best title in all of Western American literature is Bill Kittredge's "We Are Not in This Together." I'm taking the organizers at their word that this is neither a celebration of Wallace Stegner nor an elegy for him. It is a discussion of his work and his influence. My goal is to try to come to terms with Stegner, who I think is incredibly important for the American West, and to try to understand why he used the Western past the way that he did. Many of the speakers at this conference, Patty Lemerick, Terry Tempest Williams, Paige Stegner, of course, Wendell Berry, both knew and admired Wallace Stegner. I, on the other hand, although I have lived many of the places Wallace Stegner lived and taught at places where he taught, never met him. I also do not feel a particular kinship with him. Our ages provide a partial explanation, but there is, I know, more than that to this. Wallace Stegner's best friend in graduate school was Vernon Carstensen, who was my dissertation advisor at the University of Washington. I never even knew that they were friends until I read it in Richard Etchelane's book of Conversations. Vernon never mentioned it to me. He certainly never suggested that I should meet or talk with Wallace Stegner. Vernon was a very wise man. Wallace Stegner would not have liked me, and I probably would not have liked him during those years. Wallace Stegner did not like the 1960s. And I am, unlike my friend Patty Lemerick, who was my classmate at UCSC, unapologetically a child of the 1960s. A decade that has become fashionable to disparage, which I am more than happy to defend, although I realize Utah is probably not the most auspicious place in the West to defend it. Stegner said that he left Stanford at the end of the 1960s because he was pretty much fed up with the disruptions of the 60s. That was a quote. And the undergraduates at Stanford. That would be my brother Lenny. And I thought my brother and Stanford were way too conservative for my taste. When I got my degree and began to teach Western history, I became surrounded by Western historians who admired Stegner and who by and large adored Angle of Repose. They made Angle of Repose, Wolf Willow, and to a much lesser degree, Joe Hill, staples of the class reading lists in Western universities in the 1970s and 1980s. I was at the time rather mystified as to why, and this would be an easier talk if I could say that as I aged, I came to appreciate my colleagues' devotion to Stegner. But this did not happen. I am still puzzled. My puzzlement receded only because, and although this may not be true of Utah, Stegner has largely disappeared from reading lists elsewhere in the West. I wonder less about this disappearance than why, when historians did assign him, they assigned his memoir and historical novels rather than his history. I will return to this, which is really the underlying theme of my talk, but since my assignment here is in part to talk about Stegner's influence on historians, let me approach the problem in another way. It is very possible, and indeed not unusual, for writers to have a significant influence on a discipline such as history long after professors cease to assign their books and students cease to read them. Their themes have become part of the warp and weave of the discipline itself. Others have adopted their techniques and outlooks. Their conclusions have become other writers' assumptions. Does Stegner have this kind of influence? Well, Wallace Stegner's great Western themes, aridity, failure, migration and movement, the intrusion of the federal government, remain prominent themes in Western history. But frankly, they would have been major themes if Wallace Stegner never existed. As Stegner himself wrote in The American West as Living Space, aridity as a defining quality of the West has been a commonplace since John Wesley Powell in 1878. And as for conservation, another book of the 1950s, Samuel Hayes's Conservation and the Gospel of Efficiency, which can be largely read as a critique of Beyond the 100th Meridian, has a far greater impact on historical writing than Stegner's Beyond the 100th Meridian. Historians still grapple with Hayes, while Stegner goes largely unread. Stegner assimilated the existing themes of Western history. He did not create them or do anything remarkably new with them. In talking about Stegner's influence or lack of influence on me and other historians, I have so far put the cart before the horse because I've not talked about Stegner's histories themselves. And in doing so, I want to return to the puzzle. Why, if my impressions are correct, did so many historians assign Stegner's novels and memoirs, while relatively few assigned his histories? Here I cannot speak for my colleagues, but I think the answer is that Stegner didn't really write history. And I'm going to explain that as we go on. Although he clearly thought of Mormon country and Beyond the 100th Meridian, and even parts of Wolf Willow, as histories. I need to be clear here. I think that Stegner, at his best, was a wonderful writer. I think that Wolf Willow is an elegant book, one of the best ever written about the West. I would be happy to write a book half as good as that about the West. But I don't think Stegner was much of an historian. In fact, I don't think Stegner was a historian at all. My reaction to Stegner's histories is exactly what Bernard DeVoto told Stegner to be prepared for. Quote, the customary dismay of the academics. I am an academic and I am dismayed. But not for the reasons that DeVoto gave. I admire what Stegner wrote about. My dismay comes from the way that he wrote about the West. I find Stegner's histories beautifully written and utterly uncompelling. They do not recapture past worlds that I try to know. They don't even really care about them. I'm not alone in thinking this. Beyond the 100th Meridian is essentially a biography, a life and times of John Wesley Powell, the explorer, bureaucrat, and ethnologist who came to define much of the arid West. Donald Worster, who is an historian and a very good one, has also recently written a biography of John Wesley Powell, A River Running West. Don Worster, although he would attack me viciously for saying so, is actually a very kind man. When he wrote A River Running West, he had no desire to pick fights with Wallace Stegner, and so he largely ignored him. He mentioned him only twice. First, when in the introduction he called Beyond the 100th Meridian one of the most influential books ever written about the West, and credited it with launching Powell's ascent into environmental sainthood. It was also, he added, a book based on limited research into its subject or the nation's development. Or to put it more crudely, Stegner didn't know all that much about Powell or the society that he lived in. It is impossible, I think, from reading Stegner to understand why anybody would have ever opposed John Wesley Powell unless he was a greedy fool or just a plain fool. Those are the only reasons. You have no idea why John Wesley Powell's idea is lost in the 19th century, and there is a much more complicated explanation than greed. Worster again mentions Stegner in explaining how his own interpretation of Powell differed from earlier interpretations, particularly Stegner's. Stegner had made Powell the champion of science against the raiders and boosters of the West. But what Stegner ignored was what Worster emphasized. If Powell had had his way, every available drop of Western water would be controlled, allocated, and devoted to the production of alfalfa, cattle, or whatever other commodities it could bring into being. Powell was what James Scott has since called a high modernist. He believed very much in the ability of technocrats and bureaucrats to plan and modernize in order to ensure maximum productivity. Powell's conservation can't be confused with modern environmentalism. Powell wasn't against growth and maximum development. He was just in favor of elite scientific management and control. Stegner created an alternate Powell, a Powell who was a 20th century, not 19th century American, a liberal and a conservationist. He created Powell partly in his own image And this is a clue to Stegner's problem as a historian. The conclusion of Beyond the 100th Meridian strikes me as indicative of the problem with Stegner's history writing in general, and his evaluation of Powell in particular. Stegner argued that Powell was ahead of his time, and the proof was that Stegner's modern West, the West of the 1950s, was essentially the West of John Wesley Powell. Powell had triumphed, and this was a good thing. Well, as my old colleague at the University of Utah, Floyd O'Neill, used to say, there you have it. In Stegner's telling, Powell had to be ahead of his time because Stegner had no interest in locating Powell in his own time and place. He was a 20th century figure plopped down in the 19th century. Powell's real home was a timeless Western struggle between the boomers and those who protect the public interest. The boomers may have won in the short term, but in the long run, the future belonged to Powell. Not only does this interpretation dehistoricize Powell, as Worcester complains, but it takes away his ability to teach us anything. What Stegner praised as Powell's achievements were the triumphs of the Bureau of Reclamation, the Central Valley Project, the Taylor Grazing Act. And these were triumphs because those fighting for public management and public interest triumphed over the boosters, the greedy, and the monopolists. These only seem triumphs in a certain historical moment. They tell us far more about Stegner in the 1940s and the 1950s than they do about John Wesley Powell. It has now been a long time since the Bureau of Reclamation and the Bureau of Land Management were anybody's heroes. They would not even have been Stegner's heroes at the end of his life. When we rip things out of time, we not only don't understand them, we create all too many intellectual embarrassments for ourselves as history proceeds. What Stegner did to Powell, he did to Western history in general. He made it all personal, and he made it pretty timeless. Stegner's fiction, his nonfiction, and his history were ultimately always about Wallace Stegner and the preservation of the West in which he grew up and which he loved. He claimed this world, and he wrote powerfully about it. It is what made him such an important figure. A person, as the title for my talk indicates, a person to be reckoned with. Turning yourself into a factory designed to transform your life into literature is not a bad decision for a writer, but it's a pretty awful one for anyone who aspires to write history. Wallace Stegner could be quite clear and insightful about his own writing and quite critical of those who disagreed with him. And unlike Patty, in any quarrel that involved Wallace Stegner and Ken Kesey, I'm likely to end up on the side of Ken Kesey. In his essay, Coming of Age, The End of the Beginning, Stegner attacks Kesey, who had coined an aphorism that really amounts to an historian's injunction. Write what you don't know. That's what Kesey said. Write what you don't know. Now, as you've heard, Stegner and Kesey were not close. And as Stegner quotes this, you can almost feel the heat rising from the page. This injunction, Stegner wrote, was, quote, obfuscating nonsense. Kesey could be glib, a glib provocateur, but this exchange seems to me revealing. I would, for example, have agreed with Stegner if Kesey had said, oh, just make it up. And Stegner had countered that to write about other people's experiences, you need to understand them as thoroughly as you understand, or think you understand, your own experiences. But that is not what Stegner meant. And what he wrote in justification of his position is antithetical to history as I know it and attempt to practice it. He wrote, quote, the only life we know well, the one in which we are the ultimate authority, is our own. The only experience to which we can bear witness is that which we have personally endured. Let me read that again. The only life we know well, the one in which we are the ultimate authority, is our own. The only experience in which we can bear witness is that which we have personally endured. Taken literally, Stegner makes history impossible. As a historian, I would quarrel with this statement both generally and particularly. I would assert nearly the opposite. The last life we are an authority on is our own. When we lie to ourselves, we pick the best possible audience. The one that most wants to be convinced the one that will be the most complicit in our fictions. And if it were true that the only experience that we can bear witness to is the one we have personally endured, then how can we write history? History is ultimately not about us. One of its great powers is the ability to get us out of ourselves and to imagine different ways of being human. In a real sense, Stegner's dictum that our own lives are all we can truly understand explains both why he wrote the way he did and why I don't consider him a historian. When he wrote about John Wesley Powell in the arid West, he was making Powell's experience the equivalent of his own. Powell's West a surrogate for his West, and his enemies, Powell's enemies. It is hard not to read Stegner's adulation of John Wesley Powell and his use of Clarence King and Henry Adams as Powell's foils, and not see a reading back into the 19th century of his own quarrels with the New York Times and Eastern book reviewers, who never did, it is true, gave him the recognition he deserved, and even got his name wrong in his New York Times obituary. Using the past as a stage to settle present quarrels makes for powerful writing, and it makes for one poor history. Stegner's idea of great history was stories that grip the reader. And Stegner could tell gripping stories about the past, but he ripped them out of their context. To read the history sections of Wolf Willow or to see Stegner taking familiar incidents, not from primary sources, but from familiar historical works, and then rephrasing them as his own. There is nothing wrong with a popular retelling of W.W. Newcomb's changing military patterns on the Great Plains. As you can tell from the title, a popular retelling is the only possible kind of retelling there. It is slightly more problematic to retell as actual history J.W. Schultz's My Life as an Indian. My problem is not the repetition, for Stegner's version is usually better, more lively and engaging, or even the gullibility in thinking that a Schultz story necessarily is an actual version of some event. My problem is deeper. It is the draining of all the history from the material. Stegner turns his yearning for stories he never heard into a search for his own identity. I have no quarrel with stories that grip a reader, but I think historians establish a bar for such stories that is higher than the bar for novelists. I think historians' stories have to be true to a past as well as be of interest to a present, and that if they are not true to that past, they are not histories. Stegner thought it was novels that had the higher bar. He thought of history as a kind of not quite ready for prime time novel. Because, and this is a quote, in fiction you cannot explain, as you can in history, the social background and the sociological arrangement and structures on which your peculiar people function. You have to take them for granted. And it's very difficult because most of your audience won't be able to take them for granted. They will need explanation. Give them the explanation and you become a historian, because you can explain things as a historian where you can't as a novelist. Stegner's particular example of how strangeness and peculiarity, which I do think are the markers of the past, make good fiction impossible, was this place, Utah and the Mormons. He could not write Mormon country as a novel, he said, because too much had to be explained to readers who did not live in Utah. He had to write about it as what he considered to be a historian. And it might seem that if strangeness and peculiarity forced Stegner into writing history, then here in Utah, he and historians converge. For most academic historians, the strangeness of the past is our governing assumption. The Leslie Poles Hartley quote, which you've all heard, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there," is both a cliche and a slogan for historical writing. Historians go to the past not to see some universal human condition, or to see people who are essentially like us, except that they dress funny and talk differently. We go there because it is strange. And the people there can show us different ways of being human, and thus enlarge our own horizons and our own possibilities. If the past is just another mirror for ourselves, why go there? What is there to learn? But ultimately, Stegner's sense of strangeness of early 20th century Utah, or of early 20th century Saskatchewan for that matter, proved no opening to history. His motive in writing the Mormon country was, in his own words, sheer nostalgia. He wanted, he said, to get back west in flesh or in spirit, and the book gave me an excuse to come in both. The book is ostensibly about the past, but it's the past of memory. Stegner's memories of his life in Utah, and the Utah he knew. But what, it may be reasonably asked, is wrong with seeking the past of memory? Why doesn't that count as history? This is something I've actually spent a great deal of time thinking about. And it is precisely because memory is so powerful, and Stegner uses it so effectively, that I've titled this talk, A Man to be Reckoned with. Nothing is wrong with memory. Memory is powerful, and memory is important, but memory is not history. When I use the word history, I do not intend it as a simple synonym for the past. History is a particular way of understanding the past. It is a discipline. It is what professors like me teach in universities like this one. It operates according to a set of rules of evidence, procedure, and argument. But it also has a set of premises which have been repeated so often that they have become cliches. I've given you one already. The past is another country. Others are equally simple. Chronology matters. You cannot take events out of order. You cannot invent incidents to make things clearer. You cannot leave things out which, if included, would change your story. You cannot make composite characters turning several people into one. And most of all, although you can use your own interests and viewpoints to guide your study of the past, you in fact can hardly do otherwise. You cannot impose your current attitudes back onto the past. It has to be taken as much as possible on its own terms. Such rules make history a peculiar way of thinking about the past. It needs to be taught. It, like a communist cell or a Jesuit monastery or a Mormon ward, demands many members to keep each other in line. It is in multiple senses a discipline. People do not need history to think about the past. All people but amnesiacs and the demented and all cultures that I know of think about the past. They all have memories. But history is not some public version of memory. It is the opposite. It is the enemy of memory. Memories are not chronological. Our memories mix like pennies in a jar. When we recall things, 1947 is next to 1965, which is next to 1955. And memories are not fixed. We change them constantly as our lives change. Memory is not about recovering the past. It is about giving meaning to the past in light of the present. And it might be objected that in this, memory is like history, because historical interpretations too change as society changes. And this is true. But the similarity is ultimately superficial. Historians are allowed to change interpretations, but they are not allowed to change the stuff of the past itself. Historians rely on dead things, documents, monuments, runes, and more. Our great sin is to alter or change those things. But memory is a living thing, and it morphs and changes all the time. As I have said in other contexts, history is the enemy of memory. And since I come here today as a historian, this makes me, in a sense, the enemy of Wallace Stegner, at least insofar as the past is concerned. For Stegner is one of the West's great representatives of memory. To be Stegner's enemy is not to scorn him, quite the opposite. Scorn would be stupid. He is a formidable man. I have to reckon with him because memory is very powerful, often, at least in the short run, more powerful than history. But more than that, Stegner is a master of turning memory into literature. Stegner said that he intended to write a historical work in Wolf Willow, and not a fictional one. But he also says it has fictional sections. I don't think he wrote either fiction or history in Wolf Willow. He wrote a memoir. And memoirs have in some ways become the dominant literary genre of the last couple of decades. Stegner was much more honest about Wolf Willow than many current writers are about their memoirs. We are constantly surprised that these memoirs turn out to be full of invention and fabrication. We should not be. They're creatures of memory and literature. Stegner was honest enough about the parts that he made up in Wolf Willow, but my quarrel is not with the parts he made up. It is with the parts that he thought of as historical. I think there are very few historical parts to Wolf Willow. The parts that seem historical are actually mythic. This might seem a particularly outrageous charge to make against a writer who considered his whole body of work as an attack on Western myth in both its classic and pejorative sense. But for all his attacks on the mythic West in American writing, he created a myth. This myth was an ahistorical West, which for all its superficial changes was actually a changeless place of nesting women and boomer men, of precious and largely stable nature, and transient humans. He experienced the West as the frontier. It is what made it distinctive, and when Stegner could no longer detect traces of the frontier, for better or worse, the West vanished. He claimed this as history because he, as Philip Fradkin has explained, regarded the Turner thesis and the whole idea of the frontier as a validation of his own family's experience. And this, too, might seem a point of reconciliation between history and memory, between me and Stegner. And it would be, except for the complicated history of the Turner thesis itself. The vast majority of American historians have not taken the Turner thesis seriously since the 1930s, but has retained a vast popular influence. The birth of the new Western history in the 1980s came when Patty Limerick, among other things, took on the popular influence of the Turner thesis and the frontier. Wolf Willow was a child of the Turner thesis. Stegner regarded his childhood as a frontier childhood, and he thought, quote, the town's values came from the harsher frontiers that had preceded ours. I don't think early 20th century Saskatchewan was a frontier, but that is not my concern here. My concern was that Stegner thought it was. And he thought the frontier explained his family and to a large degree himself. But the Turnerian frontier that he referred to was itself mythic in the sense of being an ahistorical creation of memory that was proposed as a history and then read back onto individual lives. It is a sign of how complicated the dispute between memory and history is, and how disputed the borders between memory and history really are. In seeing his experience in the light of the frontier, Stegner became part of a very complicated chain of memory and of history. Turner was popular in the 1890s because he repeated as history what his readers already believed and remembered. What they had thought of as an individual experience, he presented as a national or regional story. Turner's themes and narratives are present in the stories of settlement that appeared in Midwestern County mug books, which some of you might have seen, which were published long before Turner published his thesis. These mug books, which were for sale, you bought it, you get to have your story in it, concentrated on local citizens who had agreed to purchase the book. These entries are of a kind. The mug book rarely, if ever, varies. A farming family enters into wild lands, builds a cabin, and over time creates a successful farm and a successful community. The heart of the narrative was the illustration that accompanied it. A successful farm with an inset of an original log cabin. The Turner thesis was counting mug books writ large. This was myth in the classic sense. It was a founding narrative. It was not a history. What Stegner did in Wolf Willow was to write a very dark and very complicated mug book entry. Because of Turner, he could frame his own memories as prototypical history that stretched back into the 19th century. He could both see his memories as history and make history simply a reflection of his memories. This is what Wolf Willow does, and it does it brilliantly. By writing of a time that predates his family's settlement, he is creating a memory and an identity, but in doing so, all the nuance and all the complexity of his own fiction drain away. He is often glib and sloppy, where he is usually thoughtful and eloquent. In fiction, he would never allow the details to go so awry as they do in his history. His comparisons are careless. He is the royal-born policeman Walsh confronting the Sioux, who had inflicted the greatest bloodletting against Indians by American soldiers since Braddock, or so Stegner says. But all the comparison shows is how little he knew about the Indian Wars and how little he cares. In his fiction, the details are virtually always correct. And I think this is the reason why my colleagues assigned the fiction. Stegner was more careful there. There he could escape into a fictional world where the details mattered and communicated and did not bring the historian up short. They could have their students confront a powerful writer struggling with memory. Against this, the history was disappointing. It was best to go with the fiction. There, Stegner was and still is a person to be reckoned with. Thank you.
mentioned that history is not memory. And as a student of history, I just wanted to ask about oral history. What can we as historians gain from oral histories, and what should we not take from oral histories? And is there a difference between American Indian oral history and white oral history?
Those are good questions, one I've confronted before. Sure, the question is, what about oral history, and particularly what about the difference between American Indian oral history and white oral history? If you're going to do oral history, you have to be very, very careful. There's one thing you can always depend on. It will tell you what your informant thinks the past means. If you think it's an accurate account of what happened in the past, then you have to go back and check it out. I don't think any good oral history can be the subject of one interview. I think you have to go back, you have to see what they say, read stuff about the time, come back with other questions, come back again, come back as many times as you have to. Memory always privileges itself. The other thing is, what's the difference between American Indian oral history and other oral histories? Here, I've worked with Indian peoples for my whole academic life, and Indian peoples are modern people. You know, one of the things you have great American Indian writers. Indian Americans are as literate as any of you. There is an oral tradition among Indians, but that oral tradition, if you follow the tracing of stories, those stories change over time. Also, those stories are very often private property, belonging to one clan or another clan. These are not seamless or transparent versions of the past. There's a different set of relations, but I think you have to be just as careful of thinking that Indian oral history, if thinking that it's simply a literal version of the past, that's where you run into trouble. It can tell you a lot, but it's not going to tell you this is what happened. And that's one of the things I like about Stegner. Stegner's perfectly honest about Wolf Willard. He says, look, I made up some of this stuff. I put people in. I collapse people together. It's what it means. I'm trying to get at the meaning of it. And that's, I think, what oral histories tend to do. The microphones coming
Yep.
You said early on in your talk that you thought that Stegner's history told us more about the period that he lived in. I guess I should preface this also by saying it comes from a literary perspective. So I was wondering if you think that there's anything that you can gain as a historian from reading those texts and thinking about what they say about how people understand a mythology, and if so, what are those things?
I'm not sure I caught the last part of your question.
What things could you possibly understand about the history of that period, like the way he's using the mythology to interpret current history? Does that make sense?
If I were to use Wallace Stegner in a class, I would use Wallace Stegner as a source for the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. I think he's a wonderful source. I think you have somebody who's trying to work the memory of a past back into the present and understand that present. So I think Stegner really teaches you an immense amount about the mid-20th century and the late 20th century. I'm just saying I don't think he teaches you that much about the 19th century, nor do I think it was really ever his intention to do so. He wants to put the past to work in a way that I regard as ahistorical. Not that I don't think the past can do work, but it's all the people that oppose Powell that interest me, the people who never, except for Stewart and others, go into the book, and it misses the whole nuance, the complexity of the 19th century West. Particularly what I'm after is what Stegner never, I don't think, ever really cared about. I think there's a microphone coming your way.
First, a relatively minor point. I think by the time they came to write his obit, they had his name correct, and the error, William Stegner, was probably in a book review.
I'll have to refer you to Philip on this, because I think
that's not why I asked for the mic. I don't know, you're an historian and you've read Powell material, and I haven't read that direct thing. I will read the new biography that you mentioned, but it just seemed to me from my reading of the 100th Meridian about a decade ago that actually Stegner was much more nuanced in his treatment of the whole issue of where Powell was. And for you to throw him into the lump of boomers seemed a little inaccurate. And then let me just make a comment and then welcome yours. On the general thesis of historian or not, I'm an economist, and I think one of the great economists of our 20th century was never really recognized as an economist, really, by much of the people in our profession, and that was John Kenneth Galbraith. And maybe for the same very reasons, that he wasn't doing economics as economists thought economics should be done. And yeah, maybe Wallace Stegner was not a historian, but he can write history, a thesis, that's all.
Well, I'd be glad to claim Galbraith as a historian if you're willing to give him up, to tell you the truth, because I think Galbraith was a very good historian in that case. Okay. And the other part is you have to, what I was not saying is that Powell was a booster. What I'm saying is that the battle in the West was not so simple as between people who were supporting the public interest and were going to be conservationists in the 20th century sense and boosters who wanted to develop the West. If Powell had had his way, it was how the West was going to be developed. That's what this is about. But in the end, if you are a Western wild animal, or if you are Western water running in a stream, the outcome is going to be pretty much the same. All of it is going to be organized, all of it's going to be tapped, and all of it's going to be used. I mean, that's where Worcester comes in. And there's no way that you can go back and read Powell and miss that unless it's not your intention of doing so. And that's, you know, that's what I think the thing is. I don't think that was really his intention. And the other thing is, people who didn't like Powell were actually people, and it's one of the things that I think modern conservation and modern environmentalism always has to be careful of. Don't demonize your enemies. The people who opposed Powell very often were anti-monopolists, and they were Democrats, small d Democrats. As they saw it, what Powell's process would do would be to deliver wealth into the hands of a minority, take away from democratic settlement, and in fact reward those who had much control over much of the land that Powell was talking about. And I know, because I'm writing a book on the railroads, that one of the people who was incredibly enthusiastic about John Wesley Powell was Collis P. Huntington of the Central Pacific and Southern Pacific Railroad. And there's no accident in that. So I'm saying that's the history. But what I'm saying is I really do admire Stegner, but that was never Stegner's aim. Stegner's aim was to take aim at what's happening to the West in the 20th century. And John Wesley Powell simply becomes a club to hammer people in the 20th century. And it's a very different set of objectives.
I think that's all the time we have for questions, but thank you again.